Lesson 2. Factors that affect investors' needs. Welcome to Lesson 2 of Module 1. Investors, whether individual or institutional, have different investment objectives. Key factors that are common to all investors, but that will vary in amplitude for each investor, include the following: required return, risk tolerance, time horizon. Investors may also have specific needs in relation to liquidity, tax considerations, regulatory requirement, consistency with particular religious or ethical standards, or other unique circumstances. Investors' circumstances and needs change over time, so it is important to reevaluate their needs at least annually. By the end of this lesson, you will be able to explain factors that affect investors' needs. Let's get started. Required return. Investors differ in how much return they need to meet their goals. The rate of return required, before and after tax, can be calculated using some goal for future wealth or portfolio value. For example, based on an investor's age, initial investable assets, expected savings, and tax situation, an advisor may calculate that a 6% rate of return before tax on investments is required for the investor to meet his or her goal of having a €500,000 portfolio value at retirement. If the required rate of return seems unlikely to be achieved, the investor's goals may have to be revised, or other factors, such as the level of savings, may have to be adjusted. An investor may take a total return perspective, which makes no distinction between income, for example, dividends and interest, and capital gains, i.e., increases in market value. The source of return, changes in value or income, does not matter to a total return-oriented investor. Alternatively, an investor may distinguish between income and capital gains, seeking income for current spending and capital gains for long-term needs. The return requirement, particularly for a long-term horizon, should be specified in real terms, which means adjusting for the effect of inflation. This adjustment is important because it maintains the focus on what the accumulated portfolio will provide at the end of the time horizon. An increase in value that simply matches inflation does not give a client increased spending power. The investment manager or advisor has to be comfortable that the investor's desired rate of return is achievable within the related constraints. Most clients would like high returns with low risks, but few investments have this expected profile. The advisor or manager has a role in counseling the client. Note, typically, higher levels of expected return will require higher levels of risk to be taken. Some investors will choose to invest in risky assets because they require high levels of return to meet their goals, but the potential consequences, the downside risks, associated with this strategy need to be understood. Other investors will have already accumulated sufficient assets that they do not need high returns to meet their goals and can adopt a lower risk approach. This situation could be the case for a pension plan that has a high funding level, meaning that its assets are sufficient, or nearly sufficient, to meet its liabilities. Other investors that have accumulated significant assets may choose to invest in riskier assets because they are capable of bearing the risk and are able to meet their goals even if they suffer losses. Investors, particularly individual investors, will usually adjust the proportion they invest in different kinds of assets over time as they age and their circumstances change. Individual investors with defined contribution pension plans can also adjust their investments within the defined contribution plan. Risk tolerance. Investors typically have limits on how much risk they are willing and able to take with their investments. As noted earlier, there is a link between risk and return. Typically, the higher the expected return, the higher the risk associated with that return. Equally, the more risk taken, the higher the expected return. The investor's risk tolerance is a function of their ability and willingness to take risk. Exhibit 1. Risk tolerance. The ability to take risk depends on the situation of the investor, such as the balance between assets and liabilities and the time horizon. If individual investors have far more assets than liabilities, any losses that result from risk-taking may not alter their lifestyle. If investors have a long time horizon, they have more scope to adjust their circumstances to cope with losses by saving more or waiting for markets to recover, although recovery and its timing cannot be guaranteed. Willingness to take risk is related to the investor's psychology, which may be assessed using questionnaires. Willingness to take risk is often thought of as a more important issue for individual investors. But even those who oversee institutional investments will have risk guidelines within which they must operate and that help define their ability and willingness to take risk. Some institutional investors, such as insurance companies and other financial intermediaries, may also face regulatory restrictions on how much risk they can take with their portfolios. There may be situations in which an individual investor's willingness to take risk and their ability to take risk differ. In such situations, the investment advisor should counsel the investor on risk and determine the appropriate level of risk to take in the portfolio, taking into account both the investor's ability and willingness to take risk. The lesser of the two risk levels should be the risk level assumed. Time horizon. The investor and advisor must be clear on the time horizon for the investments. Some investors will need to access money from their portfolios in the short term, whereas others will have a much longer time horizon. On the institutional side, for example, a property and casualty insurance company that expects to have to meet claims in the next few years will have a short time horizon, whereas a sovereign wealth fund that is investing oil revenues for the benefit of future generations will have a long time horizon, possibly decades. This variance in time horizons is also true for individual investors, as shown in the following image. The image below illustrates the time horizon for different investment goals. Exhibit 2. Time horizon for different investment goals. Someone who is planning on buying a new car, a new home, or paying for college in 2 or 3 years will have a short horizon for at least a portion of their investments. A 20-year-old saving for retirement will typically have a long horizon, probably more than 40 years. The investment horizon has important implications for how much risk can be taken with the portfolio and the level of liquidity that may be required. Liquidity is the ease with which the investment can be converted into cash. For example, an illiquid private equity investment with a likely payoff in 10 years would be unsuitable for an investor with a 5-year investment horizon. Both institutions and individuals must also consider longevity risk, which refers to the chance that life expectancy exceeds expectations and results in greater than expected cash flow needs in the future. Examples of the longevity risks faced by both institutions and individuals. Individual longevity risk. Individuals planning for retirement face the risk of outliving their assets. Institutional longevity risk. Institutions such as pension funds and insurance companies are exposed to substantial longevity risk when offering guaranteed lifetime benefits. As medicine advances and wealth levels rise, longevity risks will increase and prompt greater adoption of risk mitigation strategies, e.g., spending changes, insurance risk pooling, among individuals and institutions. Investors with longer time horizons should be able to take more risk because they have more time to adapt to their circumstances. For example, they can save more to compensate for any losses or returns that are less than expected. History shows that, over time, markets go up more often than they go down, so an investor with a longer time horizon has more potential to accumulate positive return performance. Longer-term investors are also better able to wait for markets to recover from a period of poor performance, although recovery cannot be guaranteed. Liquidity. Investors vary in the extent to which they may need to withdraw money from their portfolios. They may need to make a withdrawal to fund a specific purchase or to generate a regular income stream. These needs have implications for the types of investments chosen. When liquidity is required, the investments will need to be convertible to cash relatively quickly and without too much cost, keeping transaction costs and changes in price low when the cash is needed. Liquidity needs of individuals and institutions. Individual investors. An individual may require that a portion of the portfolio be liquid to meet unexpected expenses. In addition, The individual may have known future liquidity requirements, such as a planned future expenditure on children's education or retirement income needs. Institutional investors. For an institution, the liquidity constraint typically reflects the institution's liabilities. For example, a pension fund may expect to begin experiencing net cash outflows at a particular point in the future, i.e., when pension payments exceed new contributions to the plan, and will need to sell off some portfolio investments to meet those needs. It needs to hold liquid assets in order to do this. Regulatory issues. Some types of investors have regulatory requirements that apply to their portfolios. For example, in some countries and for certain types of institutional investors, there are restrictions on the proportion of the portfolio that can be invested overseas or in risky assets, such as equities. Regulations on the holdings of insurance companies are typically extensive to protect policyholders. Taxes. The tax circumstances of investors vary. Some types of investors are taxed on their investment returns and others are not. For example, in many countries, pension funds are exempt from tax on investment returns. Furthermore, the tax treatment of income and capital gains can vary. It is important for investment advisors to consider an investor's tax situation and the tax consequences of different investments. Investors should care about the returns they earn after taxes and fees because that is what is available to spend. For example, an investor who is subject to higher tax on dividend income than capital gains will typically desire a portfolio of investments seeking capital growth, i.e., from an increase in value of shares, rather than income, i.e., dividends from shares. Individuals may also face different tax circumstances for different parts of their wealth. For example, an individual may choose to hold some assets in a pension account if income and capital gains on assets held in a pension account are tax-exempt or tax-deferred. The investor may choose to hold assets expected to generate capital gains in a taxable investment account if capital gains are taxed at a lower rate than income. Where assets are held can significantly affect an investor's after-tax returns and wealth accumulation. Unique circumstances. Many investors have particular requirements or constraints not captured by the standard categories discussed so far. Constraints or considerations that contribute to investors' decision-making. ESG constraints. Some investors consider how environmental, social, and governance risks, collectively known as ESG investing, impact the financial performance of potential investments. Beyond considering ESG risks associated with an investment, some investors explicitly pursue an impact investing strategy, which seeks investments producing positive and measurable societal or environmental impacts, e.g., using social or environmental metrics. Course 6, Serving the Greater Good, will explore the concepts of ESG and impact investing in greater detail. Religious or ethical constraints. Furthermore, some other investors directly incorporate religious or ethical preferences and exclusions into their investment preferences. For example, some investors may not invest in conventional debt securities because they do not believe they comply with Islamic law. Portfolio or financial constraints. Investors may also have specific requirements that stem from the nature of their broader investment portfolio or financial circumstances. For example, an individual who is employed by a company may want to limit investment in that company. Limiting investment in securities issued by their employer would help the employee reduce single company exposure and gain broader diversification. Interestingly, many individuals are actually inclined to boost their holdings in their employer's shares on the grounds of loyalty or familiarity, despite the risk that this strategy entails. Such a strategy can have severe consequences if the company fails or its financial position declines. For example, many employees of Enron Corporation, a U.S. energy company, not only lost their jobs, but also suffered significant investment losses when Enron went bankrupt. Unique or specific constraints. Institutional investors may also have unique and specific requirements as a result of their objectives and circumstances. For example, a medical foundation may want to avoid investing in tobacco stocks because it believes encouraging tobacco smoking is counter to its objectives of improving health. Behavioral finance considerations. Behavioral finance attempts to understand and explain actual investor behavior, in contrast to theorizing about investor behavior. It differs from traditional or standard finance, which is based on assumptions of how investors and markets should behave. Behavioral finance is about understanding how people make decisions, both individually and collectively. By understanding how investors and markets behave, it may be possible to modify or adapt to these behaviors in order to improve investment outcomes. In other words, the way investors think and feel affects the way they behave when making investment decisions. Some of these behaviors are unconsciously influenced by past experiences and personal beliefs to the extent that even intelligent investors can deviate from logic and reason. These influences, which can be categorized and identified as behavioral biases, can affect the way risk is perceived and how risk is interpreted by someone trying to understand a person's risk tolerance. Examples of behavioral biases that impact investment decision-making vary by individual and institution and are generally categorized as either emotional or cognitive biases. Emotional and cognitive biases. Emotional bias. Emotional biases stem from impulse or intuition and tend to result from reasoning influenced by feelings. Example: loss aversion bias. Investors tend to feel the pain of losses more than the pleasure of gains compared with other client types. Thus, these investors may hold on to losing investments too long, even when they see no prospect of a turnaround. Cognitive bias. Cognitive biases stem from basic statistical, information processing, or memory errors. Cognitive errors typically result from faulty reasoning. Example: hindsight bias. Some investors may be susceptible to hindsight bias, which occurs when an investor perceives past investment outcomes as if they had been predictable. Investment outcomes are rarely, if ever, predictable. An example of hindsight bias is the response by investors to the financial crisis of 2008. Initially, many viewed the housing market's performance from 2003 to 2007 as normal, i.e., not symptomatic of a bubble. It was only later that people said, "Was it not obvious?" when the market had a meltdown in 2008. Hindsight bias gives investors a false sense of security when making investment decisions, emboldening them to take excessive risk without recognizing it as such. Lesson 2: Knowledge Check. The following knowledge check question is designed to reinforce your understanding of the concepts taught in this lesson. It is ungraded, but you are strongly encouraged to complete it. Question 1. The return requirement for an investor should be specified in nominal terms, achievable within the relevant constraints, higher for investors with a low risk tolerance. Answer for Lesson 2 Knowledge Check. Question 1. The correct answer is B, achievable within the relevant constraints. The investment manager or advisor has to be comfortable that the investor's desired rate of return is achievable within the related constraints. Up next, you have now completed Lesson 2. We hope that this lesson has helped you to understand the circumstances, interests, requirements, and specifics that affect investor decision-making and portfolio management. You should now be able to explain factors that affect investor needs. In the next lesson, you will learn about investment policy statements.